What's going on, YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and you're watching our college football channel. It's time for the playoff eliminator as we head into week 10. And of course, the first college football playoff rankings will be coming out tonight, and I think then we'll know a little bit more about the paths for these different teams and who maybe has a better chance than we thought, or maybe who has a not as good of a chance as we thought. So we'll start with the teams already eliminated. You can see a huge list of teams. This thing's really starting to narrow down. And I've still got several two-loss teams still in this thing as well. So really starting to narrow down. The new eliminations this week, pretty obvious here. Florida and North Carolina. Florida loses their third game. They have no shot to get to the SEC championship. Even if they won the SEC, you're not getting them with 3 losses. There was a path for them, but they had to beat Georgia. They had to win out. That's over for them. North Carolina, they could still win the ACC, but you're going to have 2 bad losses on the resume. And I just don't think the ACC is strong enough for a 2-loss champion to have any chance at all. I would say the same thing for the Big 12 as well. In the Big 10, we're not going to have a 2-loss champion, at least out of the East, because that's just not how it's going to go. A 2-loss team is not even going to get to the Big 10 championship. And then the SEC, maybe a 2-loss champion could get in. And perhaps even the Pac-12 could get a 2-loss champion in. Let's take a look first at the teams that are still undefeated. And, it's interesting here. Florida State, Georgia, Michigan, Ohio State, Washington. This could take care of itself. If Florida State wins out, Georgia wins out, Washington wins out, and then Michigan or Ohio State, whoever wins that game, that team's undefeated. We could have 4 undefeated teams in the college football playoff. There is now no chance of 5 undefeated Power 5 teams because Oklahoma lost this past weekend. So these are the 5 teams undefeated. Again, could be 4 of these 5 teams, could be the 3 teams, Florida State, Georgia, Washington, and the winner of Michigan, Ohio State. We'll just have to wait and see. 1-loss teams that are still alive. We got Alabama, Louisville, Missouri, Oklahoma, Ole Miss, Oregon, Penn State, and Texas. So now that Oklahoma has lost, I think, a team like Alabama, they control their own destiny. If they win out, they're going to be in. They're going to be in over a 1-loss Big 12 champion. They're going to be in over the loser of Ohio State, Michigan. You could argue if Texas wins the Big 12, maybe then Alabama doesn't get in. It's just hard to imagine a 1-loss SEC champion not getting in versus a 1-loss champion from another conference. I think Oregon's in great shape because Washington is one of those undefeated teams. They could win out, beat them in a rematch. They're in really good shape. Penn State going to have to beat Michigan and then hope to win the tiebreaker to get to the Big 10 championship game. Texas still and Oklahoma still very much alive with the 1 loss. But I really feel like when you look at the pecking order, the Big 12 is going to be the last conference. So if we have a bunch of 1-loss conference champions, I think the Big 12 is going to be that last chance. Well, I would say ACC. So ACC may be behind them, although Florida State's going to have a really good case. That'll be interesting. So, again, we'll learn a little bit more about the paths for these teams tonight when we see where they're all ranked. I showed you how I think the teams are going to be ranked in my video yesterday. If you missed that, go back and check it out. So, 2-loss teams that are still alive. And, yes, I'm still including all of these teams: LSU, Oregon State, Tennessee, USC, and Utah. I realize Oregon State, Utah, they just lost this past weekend. But if you look at the Pac-12 teams here, Oregon State, USC, Utah, all 3 of them have a chance to, they've got a chance to really add to their resume. They've got some huge games coming up. Oregon State might have a tough time because their losses are going to be a little bit worse. We'll see how the rest of the Pac-12 goes. But USC and Utah, they don't have any bad losses, and they've got a lot of huge games coming up. You look at Utah, they could win out and potentially avenge their loss to Oregon in the Pac-12 championship. And it's very unlikely. I don't think any of these teams are going to make it, but there is still a path for them, and it's somewhat realistic. And we've talked about LSU. They just need to beat Alabama, win out, and then beat Georgia in the SEC championship and hope for a little bit of help. Who gets in this scenario? Let's say Oklahoma wins out, wins the Big 12 with 1 loss, and LSU wins out and they win the SEC with 2 losses. It's going to be tough to, there's going to be a real argument for LSU to be ranked ahead of Oklahoma in that scenario. Oklahoma would not have a great resume compared to LSU, especially if, let's say, Ole Miss finishes 10-2. That would be one of their losses, and then Florida State's undefeated. That's the other loss, and you have wins over and then Georgia. So there is definitely a real shot for LSU. Tennessee, it's going to be tough because obviously they're going to have to beat Georgia, and then somebody else has to beat Georgia. And I don't see that really happening. I guess Missouri possibly this weekend. So Tennessee's a really long shot. I think LSU is the only team that has more than a 5% chance to get in if they win out. These other teams, I'd say less than 5%. All right, let's go now to the playoff picture. Really, we've changed a little bit here. So this is just based off of the front runners kind of winning out, the favorites winning out. You're going to have Ohio State, Michigan, winner of that game, Georgia, Alabama, potentially in the SEC championship. That's kind of how it feels for 1 and 2. Could be flipped. Could see. Again, I want to see the rankings tonight. If Ohio State and Michigan are ahead of Georgia, then I think the Big Ten, the winner of that game, is in a much better shot. But has a much better path to that number 1 spot. Although you look at Georgia, they could have games over Ole Miss coming up, and then a game over Alabama in the SEC championship. But Ohio State and Michigan still have to play each other. So really interested to see how those teams are ranked tonight. I believe Ohio State at least will be ahead of Georgia. I don't know about Michigan. And then Florida State, they look like they're in a good spot. A good spot for number 3 if they win out. And then Washington, Oregon, they're the front runners in the Pac-12. If Oregon wins out, they avenge their loss to Washington. They're probably going to get in. I'm not going to say they're guaranteed, but they have a really good shot. And then Washington, obviously, they just need to win out. I don't know if it's, if it comes down to an undefeated Washington or an undefeated Florida State. It's hard to say who gets 3, who gets 4. Again, the rankings tonight, I think, will tell us a lot more about that. Washington probably going to have a better resume overall, but Florida State will have a good resume as well. So that'll be really, really interesting if it does come down to that. So you could say, let's say Michigan wins. You could have Michigan versus Florida State, or you could have Michigan versus Oregon or Washington. And then on the other side, same thing with maybe Georgia, Florida State, or Georgia, Washington, Georgia, Oregon, Georgia, Florida State. That would be a fun matchup there. But this is what our current playoff picture looks like. Again, this may change when we get those rankings tonight, but this is kind of how I see it playing out. If the favorites went out, these are not my predictions. I've still got the same predictions that I had last week. So if you missed that video, I've got Michigan getting in, Georgia getting in, Florida State, and then Ohio State with the only loss coming to Michigan. I think the Buckeyes sneak in there, but I'm starting to think maybe Oregon over Ohio State. I don't know. It's tough. We'll probably do some updated playoff predictions next week. Obviously, some big games coming up this week. But then after this week, when we go to November 11th, that is going to be, you might call it Separation Saturday. A ton of big games coming up that day. And then I think after that day, we'll have 2 weeks left in the season. But we will know the path for every team. We will know what it's going to take for every team. So it'll be a very clear playoff picture after November 11th, but we'll learn a lot tonight and a lot this weekend as well. So your thoughts on the playoff picture, give them to me down in the comments below.